In the cold gray waters of the River Tyne, on a September day in 1939, a ship was born that would wear two names, serve under two flags, and bridge two navies in the most desperate hours of the Second World War. As Europe descended into the abyss of total war, the hull of HMS Victorious slid down the ways at Vickers Armstrong's shipyard in Newcastle, a gleaming testament to British naval engineering and a defiant answer to the gathering storm. No one watching that day could have imagined the extraordinary journey this vessel would undertake, or that within 4 years, she would be steaming through Pacific waters wearing American colors and carrying the improbable designation USS Robin, a British lion temporarily dressed in American eagle's feathers, serving in a theater of war thousands of miles from her intended hunting grounds. The story of this remarkable ship begins not with her launch, but with the careful calculations and compromises that shaped her very bones. HMS Victorious was conceived as part of Britain's illustrious class of aircraft carriers, vessels born from harsh lessons of naval aviation's rapid evolution and the growing certainty that another world war was inevitable. Unlike American carriers with their open wooden flight decks and maximum aircraft capacity, the British designers made a fateful choice that would define every aspect of Victorious' character. They armored her. The flight deck itself was constructed of 3 inches of hardened steel, capable of withstanding direct bomb hits that would have gutted an American carrier. Below this protective shell, additional armor plated the hangar deck and vital machinery spaces, creating a floating fortress that could absorb punishment that would send other carriers to the bottom. This decision came at a cost. The weight of all that armor meant fewer aircraft, smaller hangars, and a ship that was essentially a heavily defended airfield rather than a lightly protected airbase. The constraints of the Second London Naval Treaty further shaped Victorious' design, limiting her displacement to approximately 23,000 tons standard. Her designers crafted a hull 740 feet long with a beam of 95 feet, powered by Parsons geared turbines developing 110,000 shaft horsepower, enough to push her through the water at 30 knots. Her anti-aircraft armament bristled with 16 4.5-inch dual-purpose guns in 8 twin turrets, supplemented by dozens of smaller automatic weapons. She could carry approximately 36 aircraft in her original configuration, a number that seemed modest compared to American carriers but made perfect sense given the British doctrine of survivability over striking power. Every rivet, every weld, every carefully calculated bulkhead was designed with one purpose: to create a carrier that could take a beating and keep fighting. By May 1941, HMS Victorious was ready for war. The world she entered was already transformed beyond recognition. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs, strangling the lifelines that kept the island nation alive. And somewhere in those cold waters, the Bismarck was preparing to break out into the Atlantic convoy routes, a super battleship that could smash through any escort and slaughter merchantman at will. Victorious was thrown immediately into the deep end of naval warfare. Still working up her crew, still ironing out the 1,000 small problems that plague any new warship, she was rushed north as part of the force hunting Germany's most powerful surface raider. On the night of May 24, 1941, in the perpetual twilight of northern latitudes, Victorious launched her Fairey Swordfish and Fulmer aircraft into conditions that would have grounded lesser pilots. The sea heaved with long Atlantic swells, rain squalls reduced visibility to nothing, and the target was the most heavily defended ship afloat. The Swordfish, those obsolete-looking biplanes that seemed to have wandered into the war from an earlier era, pressed home their attacks with courage that bordered on madness. Through walls of anti-aircraft fire that lit up the Arctic gloom like deadly fireworks, they flew straight and true, dropping their torpedoes at point-blank range. One struck home, hitting Bismarck amidships. The attack demonstrated what Victorious could do, what her armored deck and determined crew could accomplish even when thrown into combat before they were truly ready. It was a baptism of fire, and the ship emerged with her head high. The months that followed hardened Victorious and her crew in the crucible of the most dangerous convoy runs imaginable. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangel were nightmares of ice, storms, U-boats, and Luftwaffe attacks. These were runs where merchant ships sailed into waters so cold that a man overboard was dead in minutes, where spray froze on deck and had to be chipped away with axes lest it capsize the ship, where German aircraft flew from Norwegian bases to attack in endless Arctic daylight, and where submarines lurked beneath pack ice waiting for targets. Victorious stood in the center of these convoys, her fighters scrambling to meet German bombers, her deck crews working in conditions that would freeze exposed flesh in seconds, her engineers nursing machinery stressed beyond design limits by extreme cold. She fought off air attacks, provided cover for merchantmen carrying vital war supplies to the Soviet Union, and learned that modern naval warfare was about endurance, vigilance, and the ability to keep fighting day after day in conditions that ground down ships and men alike. Norwegian waters knew her well. She participated in raids against German shipping along the Norwegian coast, strikes against iron or traffic that fed the Nazi war machine. In July 1941, her aircraft struck at Kirkenes and Petsamo, attacking German and Finnish facilities in the far north. These were not glamorous carrier battles that would later dominate the Pacific War. These were grinding, dangerous operations in waters where weather was as deadly as the enemy. Every sortie from Victorious deck was an exercise in skill and courage. The ship's armored flight deck proved its worth time and again. Bombs that would have blown through a wooden deck left craters in steel that could be patched and smoothed, keeping the carrier operational when other designs would have been forced to retire for repairs. But by 1943, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically, and with it, the destiny of HMS Victorious. Half a world away from Arctic waters where she had made her reputation, another war was reaching its crisis point. In the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, the United States Navy was locked in a death struggle with Imperial Japan, a campaign fought across distances that dwarfed anything seen in European waters, where aircraft carriers had become the supreme arbiter of naval power. And in early 1943, American carriers were in desperately short supply. The battles of Coral Sea, Midway, Santa Cruz, and the grinding campaign for Guadalcanal had taken a terrible toll. The Lexington lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The Yorktown had gone down off Midway. The Hornet had been sunk at Santa Cruz. The Enterprise, though still fighting, bore scars of dozens of actions and desperately needed repairs. The Saratoga had been torpedoed twice and was undergoing lengthy repairs. The new Essex-class carriers were coming, but they were months away from being ready for combat. Admiral Ernest King, the hard-driving chief of naval operations, looked at his carrier dispositions and saw disaster looming. The planned offensives up the Solomon Islands chain, operations to support MacArthur's advance in New Guinea, the eventual drive across the Central Pacific, all depended on carrier air power, and there simply weren't enough decks to go around. King swallowed his considerable pride and reached out to the British Admiralty with a proposal. Could Britain spare a fleet carrier for service in the Pacific? The request landed in London like a diplomatic bomb. The Royal Navy was hardly swimming in excess carriers. Every deck was committed to operations in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, or Indian Ocean. But Winston Churchill, always the strategist, saw opportunity in the crisis. The alliance with America was the cornerstone of British strategy, and anything that strengthened that alliance, that demonstrated British willingness to shoulder burdens in the Pacific where American blood was being spilled, was worth serious consideration. More practically, lending a carrier to the Americans would give Britain a seat at the table when Pacific strategy was being decided and would demonstrate that the Royal Navy could operate in that theater. The high-level negotiations between Churchill and Roosevelt worked out the details with surprising speed. HMS Victorious would be transferred to American operational control for an indefinite period. She would be commissioned into the U.S. Navy under American command, though her crew would remain predominantly British. She would be fitted with American aircraft, American radio and radar equipment, American communication systems, and would operate as a fully integrated unit of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. To preserve some degree of security, she would sail under the designation USS Robin, a name chosen deliberately to avoid revealing to the Japanese that a British fleet carrier was now hunting in Pacific waters. It was an arrangement unprecedented in its scope and complexity, a meshing of two naval traditions, two ways of doing things, two distinct approaches to carrier warfare. In March 1943, HMS Victorious sailed into Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia, and the transformation began. For the next 3 months, the ship underwent modifications that would have seemed impossible if they weren't happening before everyone's eyes. American shipyard workers swarmed over every inch of the carrier, tearing out British systems and installing American replacements. The Type 79 air search radar came out, replaced by American SK sets. British VHF radio equipment gave way to American systems operating on different frequencies. The British arrestor gear was supplemented with American equipment to handle the heavier American aircraft she would carry. Fire suppression systems were upgraded. Most significantly, every piece of cryptographic equipment was removed and replaced with American cipher machines. The ship would now communicate using U.S. Navy codes and would be cut off entirely from British cipher traffic for security reasons. The aircraft that would fly from her deck underwent an equally dramatic change. Gone were the ferry Fulmars and Albacores, the Seafires and Swordfish that had served her in northern waters. In their place came Grumman TBM Avengers, the torpedo bombers that were becoming the workhorses of the U.S. carrier fleet, sturdy, powerful aircraft considerably heavier and more demanding than British aircraft. American ordnance, American maintenance procedures, American fuel specifications, everything about the air group became American, requiring British deck crews and maintenance personnel to learn entirely new systems virtually overnight. The hangar deck, designed around British aircraft dimensions and handling procedures, had to adapt to different requirements. It was like teaching a grand piano player to perform on an organ, similar skills, but different techniques and a very different result. The crew transformation was perhaps the most delicate aspect of the entire operation. Approximately two-thirds of Victorious' complement remained British, the engineers who knew every pipe and valve in her machinery spaces, the damage control parties who understood her compartmentation, the deck crews who had worked her flight deck through Arctic storms and German air attacks. But American pilots came aboard, along with American Air Group personnel, liaison officers, and specialists for new equipment. British sailors traded their familiar uniforms for American ones, though they kept their Royal Navy ranks and many customs. The ship's wardroom became a fascinating cultural exchange where British and American officers learned to work together. Different traditions of tea versus coffee, different approaches to discipline and command, different terminology for identical equipment. All had to be negotiated, understood, and harmonized. That it worked at all was a testament to professionalism and adaptability of both navies. That it worked well enough to create an effective fighting unit was something approaching miraculous. Training consumed weeks of intensive effort. American pilots practiced carrier landings on the British deck, adapting to different sight pictures and approach angles. British flight deck crews learned American hand signals and procedures. The entire ship drilled on American tactical communications, learning different radio protocols that would keep them coordinated with American task forces. They practiced general quarters and damage control using American terminology. They ran through endless scenarios of air operations, coordinating launching and recovery of aircraft using systems and methods that were familiar to some but alien to others. The goal was seamless integration. USS Robin needed to operate as if she had always been an American carrier, to fit into task force formations without creating gaps or confusion, to communicate clearly in the heat of battle when miscommunication could be fatal. By the time she sailed from Norfolk in May 1943, wearing her new American identity and flying the stars and stripes from her mast, she was as ready as training and modifications could make her. The voyage to Pearl Harbor was itself an adventure, a transit across the Caribbean, through the Panama Canal, and out into the vastness of the Pacific. USS Robin arrived at Pearl Harbor in June 1943 and was assigned to Task Force 36, one of the carrier groups supporting the grinding advance up the Solomon Islands chain. The strategic objective was Rabaul, the massive Japanese base that dominated the region, but the path led through places with names becoming legendary. Guadalcanal, already secured after months of brutal fighting, New Georgia, Bougainville, each one a stepping stone bought with blood and sacrifice. In early July 1943, USS Robin sailed for her first combat operations under American command as part of the force supporting Operation Toenails, the invasion of New Georgia. The operation was designed to capture airfields that would bring American aircraft within range of Rabaul. For Robin and her task force, the mission was to patrol waters southeast of Guadalcanal, provide air cover for invasion forces, and prevent Japanese carriers from interfering with landings. It was unglamorous work compared to great carrier battles already fought in these waters, but it was absolutely crucial. If Japanese carriers could break through and attack the invasion fleet, the entire operation could collapse. Robin's job was to stand between the invasion beaches and any Japanese carrier force that might appear. For 28 days, USS Robin and her task force kept station in the combat zone. Every morning before dawn, Aircraft roared off her deck into the darkness, climbing into tropical skies to establish combat air patrol. Every evening, they returned in the fading light, guided back by American controllers using procedures the British deck crews had learned only months before. The days blurred together in a routine that was simultaneously monotonous and nerve-wracking. Hours of steaming in prescribed patterns, maintaining radio silence, waiting for the alarm that would signal enemy contact. Below decks, British engineers kept the turbines running in heat that turned the machinery spaces into steel ovens. In the hangar deck, mixed crews of British and American maintainers worked side by side, servicing Avengers that many of the British sailors had never seen before arriving at Norfolk. On the bridge, American and British officers stood watches together, their different accents blending into a unique dialect of combined naval operations. The tension was constant and invisible. Every unidentified radar contact could be the Japanese fleet. Every radio transmission might be the order to launch a full strike. The carrier's combat information center hummed with activity around the clock, radar operators tracking aircraft and surface contacts, fighter directors ready to vector interceptors toward any threat. The armored flight deck, which had seemed so reassuring in Atlantic waters, now felt vulnerable to the different threats of Pacific warfare. Where German bombers had attacked with conventional weapons, Japanese aircraft might come bearing torpedoes specifically designed for carrier attacks, or worse, the pilots themselves might choose to crash into the ship in desperate suicide attacks that were already beginning to appear in the Pacific theater. But day after day, the expected Japanese carrier strike never materialized. The enemy fleet remained in harbor or operated in distant waters, unable or unwilling to challenge the American naval forces supporting the new Georgia invasion. Robin's presence, combined with other American carriers in the task force, created a protective bubble of air power that Japanese commanders apparently chose not to test. The invasion proceeded, the airfields were captured, and American forces moved one step closer to Rabaul. For USS Robin, Operation Toenails was not about dramatic aerial battles or ship-to-ship actions. It was about presence, about the strategic weight of a carrier task force that deterred enemy action simply by existing in the right place at the right time. It was a different kind of victory, quieter and less celebrated, but no less important. Throughout those 28 days, the hybrid nature of Robin's crew created moments that ranged from comic to poignant. British sailors adapted to American coffee and complained about it with good-natured persistence. American pilots learned to navigate the cultural minefield of Royal Navy traditions and found themselves developing genuine respect for the professionalism of their British counterparts. In the evening hours, when flight operations had ceased and the ship settled into the relative quiet of night steaming, British and American sailors gathered on the flight deck to smoke and talk, sharing stories of homes on opposite sides of the Atlantic, comparing experiences of war in different theaters, building the kind of bonds that transcend national boundaries. The ship herself became a symbol of Allied unity, proof that despite different traditions and methods, the English-speaking navies could work together toward common goals. When USS Robin finally departed the South Pacific Combat Zone in August 1943, having completed her assigned mission without firing a shot in anger, there was a sense of anticlimax among some of the crew. They had trained for combat, prepared for the kind of desperate carrier battles that had already claimed so many ships in these waters, and instead had experienced the Pacific War at its most strategic and least kinetic, a game of positioning and deterrence where the threat of force was as important as its application. But the senior officers understood what had been accomplished. Robin had demonstrated that a British carrier could operate seamlessly within American task forces, that the two navies could integrate their procedures and doctrines, that Allied naval cooperation could work at the highest operational levels. The lessons learned during Robin's Pacific deployment would prove invaluable when the British Pacific Fleet would later join American forces for the final campaigns against Japan. The voyage back to Britain was almost leisurely compared to the journey out. USS Robin transited the Pacific, passed through Panama, and crossed the Atlantic to arrive in British waters in September 1943. At Scapa Flow, the great British naval base in the Orkney Islands, the process of transformation was reversed. American equipment came out, British systems went back in. The Avengers flew off to American squadrons, replaced by British aircraft. American radio and radar gear was carefully removed and shipped back to the United States. The cipher machines that had allowed her to communicate with American forces were replaced with British cryptographic equipment. Slowly, methodically, USS Robin became HMS Victorious once more, shedding her American identity like a costume after a performance. British sailors exchanged their American uniforms for familiar Royal Navy dress. The stars and stripes came down, the white ensign went back up. Within weeks, it was as if the American interlude had never happened, except in the memories of those who had lived it and the strengthened bonds between the two navies that would endure for the rest of the war and beyond. But HMS Victorious was far from finished with her war. In 1944, she rejoined the British Eastern Fleet, operating in the Indian Ocean against Japanese forces. Her armored deck, which had seemed like over-engineering in the Atlantic and an interesting quirk during her American service, was about to prove its value in the most dramatic way possible. As British carriers pushed closer to Japan itself in 1945, participating in strikes against the Japanese home islands and supporting the invasion of Okinawa, they encountered a new and terrifying weapon, the kamikaze. Japanese pilots, often young and barely trained, deliberately crashed their aircraft into Allied ships in suicide attacks that combined the explosive force of bombs with the kinetic energy of the aircraft itself. American carriers, with their wooden flight decks, suffered catastrophic damage from these attacks. Fires that raged out of control, flight decks that were blown open, ships that had to be withdrawn from combat for extensive repairs or were lost entirely. HMS Victorious met the kamikazes and shrugged them off. On multiple occasions, Japanese aircraft crashed directly into her armored flight deck. The impacts were tremendous. Twisted wreckage, fires, explosions that would have crippled American carriers. But the 3 inches of hardened steel held. Damage control parties rushed to the impact sites, pushed burning wreckage over the side, extinguished fires, and within hours, the flight deck was operational again. Craters in the steel were filled, smoothed, and marked. Aircraft were launching and recovering while American liaison officers watching from nearby ships shook their heads in amazement. The design decision made back in the 1930s, the choice to armor the flight deck at the cost of aircraft capacity, had been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. Victorious could take hits that would sink other carriers and keep fighting, a resilience that became legendary among both British and American forces in the Pacific. The statistics were remarkable and spoke to the fundamental soundness of the armored carrier design. While American carriers struck by kamikazes typically required weeks or months of repair, if they survived at all, British armored carriers like Victorious could absorb multiple hits and remain operational. The armor didn't prevent damage entirely. It couldn't stop fires or casualties among deck crews caught in the open during attacks, but it prevented catastrophic structural damage, kept the ship fighting, and most importantly, kept her crew alive. When Victorious eventually returned to Britain after VJ Day, she bore the scars of multiple kamikaze strikes, but she steamed home under her own power, her machinery intact, her crew proud. The post-war years saw HMS Victorious undergo a transformation as dramatic as her wartime conversion to USS Robin, but this time for a different purpose. Naval aviation was evolving rapidly, jets were replacing propeller aircraft, and carriers designed in the 1930s needed extensive modernization to remain relevant. Between 1950 and 1958, Victorious underwent a reconstruction so extensive that she emerged as virtually a new ship. An angled flight deck was installed, allowing simultaneous launch and recovery operations that had been impossible with the old straight deck design. Steam catapults replaced the older hydraulic systems, giving her the capability to launch the new generation of heavy jet aircraft. Her island superstructure was rebuilt with modern radar and communication systems. Her anti-aircraft armament was updated for the missile age. The ship that had chased Bismarck and served as USS Robin emerged from the dockyards capable of operating modern jet fighters and capable of facing the challenges of Cold War naval operations. This modernized HMS Victorious served throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, participating in exercises, showing the flag, and maintaining Britain's naval presence in an increasingly complex world. She was no longer the newest or the most powerful carrier in the Royal Navy. Newer ships had been built or were under construction, but she remained a capable and reliable platform. Her crew, most of whom had not been born when she was launched in 1939, operated a ship that was a living bridge between the age of propeller aircraft and the jet age, between World War II and the Cold War. The old warrior had adapted, evolved, and continued to serve. By 1969, however, the inevitable could no longer be postponed. HMS Victorious, now 30 years old despite her extensive modernization, was worn out. The hull that had been riveted together in Newcastle in the late 1930s, that had survived Arctic storms and German bombs, kamikaze attacks, and the stresses of 3 decades of hard service, was simply tired. New carriers were entering service. The Royal Navy was shrinking in the face of budget pressures, and there was no longer a place for the old ship. In 1969, HMS Victorious was decommissioned for the final time, her white ensign lowered for the last time, her crew dispersed to other ships. The following year, she was sold for scrap, and the ship that had served 2 navies and survived some of the most intense combat of World War II was cut up for salvage. The story of HMS Victorious, USS Robin, is more than just the biography of a ship. It's a testament to the flexibility and ingenuity that total war demands, to the ability of allies to set aside differences and work toward common goals, to the adaptability of sailors who can learn new procedures and integrate new methods while maintaining their professionalism and effectiveness. It's a reminder that naval power in the 20th century was not just about individual ships or fleets, but about alliances, about the ability to pool resources and share burdens across oceans and between nations with different traditions but common purpose. The image of British sailors in American uniforms, operating a British ship under American command with American aircraft on deck, captures something essential about the Allied victory in World War II, the willingness to do whatever was necessary, however unusual or unprecedented, to defeat the Axis powers. In the decades since Victorious was scrapped, her story has become a footnote in naval histories, overshadowed by more famous ships and more dramatic battles. Few remember USS Robin or the unique chapter when a British carrier wore American colors in the Pacific. But for those who served aboard her during that remarkable period, for the historians who study the intricate cooperation that characterized Allied naval operations, and for anyone who appreciates the complexities of coalition warfare, the story of HMS Victorious remains extraordinary. She was a ship that served 2 flags with equal distinction, that bridged 2 navies at a critical moment in history, and that demonstrated through her service that the bonds between allies, when forged in the crucible of war and tempered by mutual respect and common purpose, could overcome any obstacle and achieve the impossible. From the gray waters of the North Atlantic to the blue expanses of the Pacific, from chasing battleships to deterring carriers, from surviving kamikazes to operating jets, HMS Victorious lived a life as varied and remarkable as any ship that ever sailed, and her legacy endures as a symbol of Allied cooperation and naval resilience.